Welcome to this month's edition of RTO Insights, brought to you by APRO, the Association of Progressive Rental Organizations, the National Trade Association for the RTO Industry, and sponsored by Rent Direct, a division of Nationwide, the country's largest retail buying group. My name is Winn III. I'm the General Counsel for the association. I thought I would talk this month a little bit about the trade association, where it came from, what it does, why it exists. That story goes back to 1980. The RTO industry was in existence, certainly, and thriving in parts of the country. Chuck Sims was the leader in the industry with Remco that had 50 stores all over the country, from Atlanta to Seattle. The common wisdom being at the time, you couldn't have a rent-to-own store in a city with a population of less than 250,000 people. But Holliday was the second largest rental dealer at the time, with ABC Rentals, mostly in Texas. Both of those companies had been sued numerous times over the lease versus sale controversy. They had won some of those lawsuits, but they had lost some of those lawsuits. They were worried about the continuing viability of this fledgling industry, and they got together and said, we really ought to have a meeting of rental dealers and think about getting organized for our common protection. They scheduled that first meeting in the summer of 1980 in July. I was invited to that meeting, but Holliday had heard me give a legal seminar at a management development program put on by the University of Texas that he attended in Austin a few months previously. I had talked about the wonderful world of government regulation and its effect on business, and he invited me to come give basically that same talk to rent-to-own dealers. I had never met a rent-to-own dealer and didn't know what rent-to-own was, but gladly accepted the invitation. I made my talk. Other dealers gave talks. Some vendors were there. They gave talks. GE Capital was there. They talked about financing. At the end of the day, the rental dealers began to talk about whether or not they should organize. Somebody said, if we're going to set up some sort of company, we need a lawyer. I was the only lawyer in the room. They hired me then to study the feasibility of setting up a trade association for the rent-to-own industry. I agreed to undertake that task. There were already several trade associations in existence in related industries. There was the American Rental Association that represented the rental yards, party goods, and small machinery, rent by the hour, rent by the day. There was NARDA, the National Appliance Retail Dealers Association, made up of retailers around the country, mostly the smaller ones. There was the FRAA, the Furniture Rental Association of America, made up of the furniture rental companies, Court and Grand Tree. I went and met with each one of those groups, and each said they would love to carve out a place for the rent-to-own industry inside of their organizations. I reported that back to the study group that had been set up at that original meeting, and the conclusion was, no, we want our own club. The next step was to develop some draft bylaws and other corporate documents for a nonprofit trade association, which I did, and the leadership, really Mr. Holliday and Mr. Sims, called another meeting of rental dealers for that November, at which meeting I presented my findings, showed this group of rental dealers, 40 or so, the draft bylaws, and asked them to vote whether or not they wanted to set up a trade association, and they unanimously did and agreed to assess themselves originally dues. They elected a board of directors, and the board of directors started having meetings thereafter every month or so to come up with a budget for the trade association, some collection practices, some best practices for the industry, and some collection practices, some ethical standards, and some other procedures for running a trade association. None of us knew a lot about trade associations, but we learned as fast as we could. The original budget was for $80,000, I remember, for that first year. Chuck Sims had his home office in Houston, Texas, but Holliday had his home office in Dallas, Texas. Austin, Texas was sort of neutral territory between the two cities. Neither wanted the other to be in complete control. I had just hung out a law license and had extra space in my law office. I offered to rent this fledgling trade association some office space, and they took me up on that offer. So the very first APRO office was in my law office. So the very first APRO office was in a high-rise on Congress Avenue in Austin, Texas. that it sublet from me and my law partners. We proceeded to develop letterhead for the trade association. I hired a secretary, and we started making plans for the first ever convention to be held in August of 1981. We held that first convention in Dallas, Texas. Rental dealers could attend that meeting for free. We made the mistake of having an open bar, and we lost $35,000 at our first convention. I ended up having to borrow $10,000 from Chuck Sims Remco in order to make payroll and pay the rent the last couple of months of that year. The association, though, did take off after that. As we learned where rental dealers were, we invited them to join, and they did. We had several successful membership drives early on, and APRO has continued to grow, sometimes in fits and starts, ever since. APRO has always been out front of the industry, trying to put the industry's best foot forward. That's the mission of this trade association. There's a dedicated staff in Austin that can answer most of your questions. If you have legal questions, you are more than welcome to call me or email me. We also have a wage and hour lawyer on retainer, and if you have wage and hour questions, you can call Brian Farrington at the Dallas office. All of this information, incidentally, is available at the APRO website, rtohq.org. Stop. On behalf of the Trade Association, I want to personally thank you for your continuing support of our efforts. And remember, treat your customers like royalty. They deserve it. I'm Ed Winn III, APRO General Counsel.